Hi, welcome to my channel where we provide an alternative view to the common narrative. Today I'm gonna go on a limb and provide a view that is gonna be very controversial. So if you're interested, it's about mostly the future economic situation or environment in the next couple of years and maybe future. So if you are interested, please continue watching. Hi, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to go on a limb and provide you a controversial view of the future of the world configuration. All right, let's call it configuration. Currently, we have a unipolar world, and we are moving to a multipolar world. I've talked many times about my friend in Panama, and if he watches this video, then he will have some serious ammunition to argue with me. So let's see if he tries to do it. In any case, the point here is that if you look at certain political dispensations, if you want to call it like that, we have the normal democratic system, then we have socialism, and then we have communism, and then we have dictatorships, and then we have kingdoms with monarchies and stuff like that. Now, all of these systems have failed, and don't even talk about that democracy is a viable option, because it's usually being abused over a certain time period. It's going to be abused by, call it, either good people or either bad people. So what I believed always is that the best political system that will function is basically a dictatorship. But the one condition is that the dictator is not centralized on himself, but is wholly committed to the welfare of the people. Now, if you want to argue like Putin is a dictator, then Putin is for his country and for Russia, and that would have been a good example. But unfortunately, life is not perfect, and dictators are not perfect, and getting a person that will sacrifice or dedicate his life to his country instead of himself, those are 1 in a trillion people or 1 in a billion people. So dictatorship is not sustainable or not a good system. But all the other factors if he was, then it would have been good for the country. So what I more believe is that like a federal system, but a very downgraded federal system. Basically, I'm not sure how it in other countries are called, but in South Africa we call it municipalities, which are more or less towns or so on. And that would be basically the main ruling, because then you have direct influence on who you elect and who you don't elect. And then those guys can go into provinces or oblast or whatever you want to call it. And from there on, we can go to the nation state, and the nation state has then limited responsibility, and maybe like the military and you had roads or whatever is internationally orientated. But that's not the point why I'm talking today. At this stage, we have a unipolar world with America as the main power in the world. And there is a constant, there is now an opposing force in the form of Russia and China, which are going to create a multipolar world that is now a well, let's call it a counter-offense against the Western hegemony, and the basically ruling actions of America. And in principle, that sounds fine. It's hunky-dory, you know? It's like we want to have multipolar world. We don't want any company, any country and so on to dominate the scene and tell people what else to do and what they shouldn't do, etc., etc. Like, yeah, you went General Slente that says, who the hell are you to tell me what to do? In any case, I like Gerald. In any case, the question is gonna multipolarity world is gonna be that the right my English today. Is that gonna be the right assembly? No. Composition in order to make create call it basically world peace or stability or a individual development of certain countries, etc., etc., etc. Everything that we are promised that it will be the new utopia. And unfortunately, I don't agree with that. Well, I don't really not agree with that. But there's a possibility that this thing might not work. And that is what I'm going to try to discuss or present basically. If you look at, I've mentioned it many times before, up to the Second World War, and by the end of the Second World War, or a little bit later, we still had nationalism. And we had different values in the world. We had more a bigger sense of patriotism, sacrifice for your country, honor, family values, all this story that made life actually possible in that era. And that created a lot of conflicts in the world, especially let's talk about Europe. I mean, the Germans were still Germans, the French were still French, the British were still British, and the Belgians were still Belgians, and the Austrians, and so on, etc. So each had a nationality, and they were proud of their nationality, and that makes them actually very nationalistic, and that is why there was a lot of wars and conflicts in Europe itself. Because of this feeling and view of the population, which was then sometimes exploited by their leaderships. But after the Second World War, the society was slowly changed. And I've talked about it before. The whole European system was actually developed and orchestrated by the CIA. And Germany was still conquered and is still conquered by today. The World War II has never ended. You can look at some of my other videos about that. And basically, if you look at society today, there was a slow progress of destroying nationalism or nationalistic views. I mean, to a state where the Germans are not the Germans, they are now French and British and Arabian and Moroccan and African and whatever nations. They are not a pure, the whole structure of nationalism has been destroyed. Therefore, there is no such thing as patriotism anymore and self-sacrifice. Family values have been destroyed, so there's nothing more to be protected against, where people, in the old days, you had family values and you will die, sorry, die for your family, die to protect your children, die to protect your property. All those things have been destroyed over these years. Yes, we have wokeness and all this other stuff, but I'm not talking about that. If you look at the more, in stark contrast, the old Soviet bloc people, countries, like Romania and Poland and Hungary and so on, they are still a huge amount of nationalism and nationalistic pride, family values that hasn't been destroyed by Western influence yet, and also ethnicity. I mean, there's even conflicts like ethnicity, like in Serbia, Kosovo, Albanian, and in Georgia and in Ukraine, we have all these nationalistic views and so on and so on. So you can see that there's the influence of the West, the slow breakdown of borders or nationalistic views has not been that long in those countries, and therefore they still have to be converted to a non-nationalistic, non-patriotic type of environment so that they can all gel and all become one world population with no reason to be nationalistic and to fight for your country, because you don't have a country anymore. That's the whole purpose of the EU. And if you also look at the EU's principle, they have become much more authoritarian and enforcing European rules and objectives about the sovereign laws of different countries, where Poland again is the most prominent. And we see also with Hungary and so on, that doesn't want to go with the sanctions against Russia and so on. But the EU, they are trying their best to do it. And also, if you can see the German support, financial support for the rest of the EU, like Italy and Spain and Greece and so on. So the borders became based in the Schengen agreement, where borders are now fluid. There are no basically borders in the Schengen area. So travel, working permits, non-existent anymore. So basically, the nationalistic view of Europe has been destroyed. Now, the same has happened in America, but America was never different countries, it was just different states, so it was a lot easier to do it like that. And with also the destruction of national identity and so on, it's much easier to control the people, because for what are they going to rise up? How are they going to basically associate themselves with different groups and then come in, riots? Well, the French are renowned for riots. So you can't take the French as a example and so on. But even if they hold the riots, they sometimes are 3 or 4 different views for reasons why they hold these riots. So you can't all do it over the same type of you can't treat them all the same. So then you can also look at the influence that even the Western has on China and Japan. Well, Japan is totally destroyed. China, Taiwan, even in Russia, you had all these woke, modern, Western-orientated, valued people that had these Western-orientated values. And you can see with a lot of those people that try to avoid the draft, military draft in Russia, as well as the people that fled Russia at the beginning of the special military operation. Now, those people have all succumbed to the Western influence of the destruction of family values and patriotism and nationalism and wara. All that goes with it. And therefore you could control the people. And in my opinion, that is also the biggest reason why there hasn't been a war in Europe for the last 80 years. We're not talking about Serbia, Kosovo, and Bosnia and so on. Those are still basically part of the Soviet Union at that stage. And they had to go through a transition which was very difficult, and nationalism was still very prominent. Religion plays a big role in that. So please don't count Ukraine and Serbia as part of it. Those were the exception to the rules, and the reason is quite clear. So basically that created peace in the world. Yes, and then we had America, that had to maintain its control over the world, call it financial systems, resources, and had to suppress any person that went against basically that threatened current status quo, if you want to call it like that. And that's why we had the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and so on, Libya and Syria. Those were problem countries for America and were basically also used as example to keep the other people, other countries in toes, in line. Yo, my English today. Anyway, so although you can, in principle, you can disagree in terms of violence and stuff like that, if you can ignore those emotional feelings, that goes against that principle, and you just look at the technical aspects, and unfortunately, America had to do what it had to do, what it did. And they bullshit us, everybody, but that's not important. So effectively, the core summary of the current status, the unipolar world, Western in control of the world, was destruction of values, destruction of nationalism, feelings, destruction of identity, destruction of family values, destruction of whatever you want to call that, was paramount in order to prevent wars and conflicts. Because if you look at today, like, say, Armenia and Azerbaijan, that is an ethnic conflict. In contrast to the Western breakdown. You look at Serbia, Kosovo, that's still ethnic. Georgian, ethnic. Well, the Chechen war, ethnic. And so forth. You can go around that. Ukraine, ethnic. Russians were in Ukrainians, etc., etc. So a feeling of nationalism and so on is a danger for violence or for peace. It's a danger for peace and creates conflicts and wars. Now we are going to a multipolar world. That sounds excellent. Now we have no more dictator, if you want to call it. Everybody, according to the principles that the Chinese and the Russians are actually trying to convey, is that each country has now its own national beliefs and system, and no country outside should interfere in the domestic issues for that country. But trade can go ahead and relationships can be built and so on, but no interference or dominance of any country by another country. That is the core principle. And what we are in effect then doing is we are again creating a feeling of nationalism, patriotic values. Listen to Putin and others. Family values. Protection of family values, protection of religion, patriotism, sacrifice for your fatherland. Those are the principles of Russia. China has a different culture, but it's also the same principles. Unless it's in terms of the pure principle, not the Western influence on China, the other side, the original Chinese type of culture. It has always been honor, sacrifice, dedication, hard work, family values, country, leadership support. Those are the values there. And so we have different values in Thailand and Vietnam and Iran and India. And I mean, India has so many different cultures and languages and tribes and so on. I mean, even on a religious basis, they are still killing each other for nothing. Then they have, violence of women, men against women, and based on ethnicity, the class in India and in Pakistan, the class divide, and stuff like that. Africa also has a different culture, But there we have, say, the local tribe leadership, and then the tribe that falls under him, and so on and so on. Family values, respect of the elders, respect of the community leader, if you want to call it. Traditional leader here in South Africa, we call them. We still have a king, the Zulu king here, which demands a lot of respect and resources. So basically, you are again, the multipolar world will create a system of identification, self-identification, tribes, countries, nationalistic views, family values. It's basically going to restore all the characteristics of the Western of the society that led to wars, because you created an identity, a place of belonging to, something you are prepared to defend. That is what it might lead to. And that is the danger in multipolarity that is currently being promoted by the Russia and China. So the question is, what's important to you and what would you accept? Do you want to be recognized as one of the masses, or do you want to belong to some? Because also what happens in the Western world, a typical example would be loneliness. A lot of people in the Western world have no more family or real friends, and they are feeling a sense of loneliness. They have the internet with which they talk out, but they don't see people physically always. People have become detached from other people and made them more selfish, individualized type of human beings. Where in the Western world we still have families and groups and ethnicity and identity. You understand? And that unfortunately was always the reason or why we had wars in the past, or what could be exploited by certain actors in order to create wars for their own benefit. Doesn't matter how you see it. But if you have a unifying principle of idea, a unity, then you can manipulate that unity as a unit, where you have to manipulate the modern Western world as an individual. And an individual is weak. He can't go up and he can't do it himself and stuff like that. But a unity can be strong depending on the size of it. It's all about numbers. So my view at this stage is that well, I hate the Americans in that respect. Not that I hate the Americans, no. I hate the way Americans exploited and enslaved the rest of the world for the last 80 years. And I would like to get out of that dominance type of exploitation of the USA. But it has its certain benefits as well. Is the multipolar world going to have better benefits? It will probably, for the first 10, 20 years, it might go all, well and so on. But, as I spoke in my previous videos, there is a limited amount of resources in the world. There are only so many oil wells. There are only so many iron mines. There are only so many gold mines, platinum mines, iron mines, lithium mines. Yes, there's only so much finite amount of resources in the world. And as the world economies or the countries' general GDP and welfare index climbs and so on, and they create a huge middle class, then more resources are required. And as in my previous video, then I talk about life is a constant battle for survival and supremacy. And the strongest will survive at the end of the day, or the most adapted, which you can also classify as the strongest. So at the end of the day, is that we're going to have not a world always of peace, but we are all striving for the same purpose. But we cannot, because I also stated before, there will always be very clever people and then people with very low intelligence. There will always be good guys and bad guys. There will always be weaklings and strong people and leaders. There will always be sheep. So in a world, you cannot have a uniformity and we are all equal like in communism. That's not possible. So maybe also on terms of competition. Here in South Africa, I had directly to do with that, is the Chinese were building a factory here in South Africa, and they were all importing the raw materials, the steel and so on, and they were importing their labor force. They erected the whole factory and so on at low quality, by the way, lots lower than our building standards. They violated actually our building standards, and then they left. And we, as a South African society, had no benefit in the erection of that factory. So now we are angry. How can you import all this labor and this material and so on? It's destroying our labor market and so on. So now we have the first aggressive nature in this whole business. And the more that's going to happen, the more the local companies and people are going to get aggravated with the Chinese, who are building all these factories and stuff and so on, and we don't get any benefit of that. And then there are going to be protests, and then there are going to be riots, and then there are going to be violence, and you see how it can escalate. Just because China has now sort of imported. And that's typical. And China is going to be the strongest economic powerhouse in the multipolarity world. And even if they don't want to do it, it's not the intention that they're going to enforce or damage another country's industry. It's a natural flow out of it. It's a natural consequences of that action. So there will be later on a resentment. Then we now look at China is buying most of the gas from Russia, the oil from the Middle East, and then say America, no, not America, but Europe now also needs gas. So now we have a resources clash. Now, whose money is going to be the strongest? Because at the end of the day, it's all about money. So say Qatar is going to sell the gas to the highest bidder. Well, Chinese have a lot of money. So Europe is in a decline, falling in the decline. They have less and less money, less and less production, less and less competitiveness. They cannot print their money anymore because they have high inflation. So compare the euro against the yuan. Yuan wins, China wins a bit, Europe has no gas, Europe is going to freeze. That's the reality of what might come. In spite of all this nice talk about multipolarity world. So the multipolarity world is also not an ideal system. So we will have to watch and see. For the first couple of years, we will have a transition. That will be difficult. Then we might have, say, 10, 15 years of good economic conditions and everything would be fine. And then after that, we might have the resource wars. The constant, and then being also exploited, the whole system of nationalism and everything that I talked about, the human values that are basically restored, the same human values that led to all the wars in the past. So, that is my alternative controversial view for today. And don't believe multipolarity will solve everything. In the short term it might, but in the long term it will have its own problems. And then we have to see how the world develops. Okay. So that's my story for today. Until next time. Cheers.